Welcome aboard, and welcome to History to Relax. Tonight, we invite you to journey deep beneath the waves, into the narrow corridors of a German U-boat during the Second World War. This is a story of steel, silence, and survival, told in a gentle voice, one calm moment at a time. If you enjoy slow, immersive storytelling designed to help you unwind, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to know what stories you'd like us to explore next. Now, dim the lights, settle in, and let the quiet rhythm of the deep sea guide you. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The hatch closes. The harbor smells of salt, diesel, and iron. The sea laps quietly against the concrete piers as the morning fog settles over Wilhelmshaven. The sun has not yet risen, but the dockyard hums with quiet purpose, slow footsteps on wet stone, hushed voices, the occasional metallic clatter of tools on hull. Somewhere, a gull cries and flaps into the gray light. Beside the quay rests U-96, a long, narrow vessel of steel painted in a dull, weathered gray. Her conning tower juts above the water like a dorsal fin, and along her sides the black stains of rust run down into the sea. The submarine is awake, though still. Her diesel engines lie silent for now, her hatches open to the pale morning, her crew gathering beside her in quiet formation. 22-year-old Matrosenfreiter Carl Fischer stands among the other men in his oilskin jacket, cap low over his brow, duffel at his feet. He has the lean build of a sailor, but the eyes of someone not yet hardened. This will be his first patrol. A hand-me-down wool scarf wraps his neck, a gift from his mother, worn thin but holding the scent of home. Around him, veterans of past missions murmur quietly. Some chew bread in slow bites. One smokes without looking at the flame. Another stares down the hull as if memorizing each rivet. No one speaks loudly. Voices do not carry here. The captain arrives. He walks with quiet authority, Cap-Eaton Lieutenant Lehman, a man in his early 30s with a high forehead, a worn coat, and gloves tucked behind his belt. He carries no visible weapon, but he has the posture of command. He does not raise his voice. He simply says, "Board." One by one, the crew moves forward. Boots thud lightly against the gangway. Men duck into the open hatch on the conning tower and disappear into the boat. No fanfare, no music. Just the methodical boarding of 25 men stepping into a tube of steel meant to vanish beneath the sea. When Fisher climbs the conning tower and peers down, he sees only shadows and red light. The interior glows faintly like the belly of some mechanical beast. Wires, pipes, and dials stretch in every direction, each surface coated in a dull film of oil and condensation. The air smells like cold metal and something older, the scent of many men packed into tight space for far too long. He lowers himself down the ladder. The warmth hits him immediately. Not cozy warmth, thick, stagnant warmth. Warmth that has nowhere to go. It clings to the walls and wraps around his skin like a wet cloth. In the forward compartment, the torpedoes are already in place. For long silver tubes lie along the hull, sleeping giants bound in place with straps and chains. The torpedo room is cramped, with bunks squeezed in between the tubes. Men will sleep beside these weapons, hearing their creak and shift with every roll of the boat. Fisher finds his assigned space, a narrow cot with barely enough headroom to sit upright. Above him, another bunk. Below him, another man's locker. There is no privacy, no doors, no corners to vanish into. Just bodies and breath. He stows his duffel and steps into the central corridor. The boat narrows here. Pipes run along the ceiling, sweating moisture. The walls are lined with gauges, switches, and valves, all painted the same lifeless gray. There is no paint for decoration, no room for beauty. Every inch serves a purpose. He reaches the control room. Here, the crew gathers for final checks. The chief engineer calls out tests in a flat tone. Dials are read, levers pulled, valves turned. All is done without panic, without excitement. This is ritual. This is routine. It has to be. One of the diesel engines coughs into life. The floor vibrates slightly. A low hum rises in the steel, growing steadier as the machinery wakes. Above, the final crates of fresh food are being passed down. Loaves of bread, cans of meat, boxes of onions. They will be stored wherever space can be found, in corners, under floorboards, even in the toilets. Soon, the diesel is shut off again. Silence returns. The last crewman drops down the ladder. The cook swings the hatch closed behind him with a heavy clang. Then, slowly, with the precision of a closing vault, the upper hatch is sealed. The world outside is gone. Inside, the lights dim. The only illumination now is the soft red glow that protects night vision. It makes every man's face look tired and old. Sweat forms quickly. The air is still. The pressure of silence creeps in. The order is given. Tauchen. Dive. The dive planes are adjusted. Ballast tanks flood with seawater. A slow tilt shifts the boat downward. She creaks softly, protesting. Bolts groan. The hull compresses. There is no window to see the sea. Only the gauges and the growing weight in the ears tell the story. They are sinking. Fisher feels the tilt in his legs. He grips the nearest pipe, not out of fear but instinct. Water rushes outside the hull, not in torrents but as an unseen presence. Depth 20 meters, then 30, then 40. The boat levels off. The engines shift. The hum changes pitch. They are submerged. Now begins the silence. Every sound is magnified. The drip of condensation from a pipe, the clink of a spoon in a cup, the faint throb of the electric motors. Conversation becomes whispers. Boots are never hard on the floor. Voices carry too far. The temperature rises quickly. Sweat beads on foreheads. The boat was built for cold Atlantic waters, but inside it becomes warm, then hot, then humid. There is no escape, no breeze, no fresh air. Just recycled breath and the constant sting of oil fumes. Fisher walks to the galley, a space no wider than a closet. The cook is already working, boiling potatoes over a small burner. Steam thickens the air. Beside him, sausages hang in nets, swinging slightly with the motion of the boat. The cook says nothing. He simply stirs. The smell of onions and canned fat wafts into the hallway. Back in the control room, Layman consults the navigation charts. They are headed west toward the Atlantic. It will take 2 days to reach open waters. Until then, they must run deep and slow, avoiding patrols. Fisher takes his first shift at the hydrophones, listening through headphones for any propeller sounds nearby. He hears only the distant groan of water. Occasionally, a whale call echoes faintly. Most of the time, there is nothing. Off-duty men sleep in shifts, heads near oily pipes, feet brushing lockers. The bunks are always warm from the last body. No one has their own bed. They call it hot bunking. You sleep where someone else just sweat for 4 hours. The air grows stale. The smell of men begins to mingle with diesel, smoke, and mildew. Some wear their clothes for days, others strip to their undershirts. There is no true bathing, just a cloth and a bucket. The toilet, shared by all, is at the bow and occasionally overflows when the pressure changes. Time becomes abstract. Red light makes it hard to tell night from day. Watches rotate. Meals come at odd hours. Letters from home are locked in a drawer until the captain sees fit to read them aloud. In one corner of the boat, the youngest sailor has begun to feel the weight of the dive. He says little, stares too long at the walls, jumps at sudden noises. He will be watched. Men do not always return from their first patrols as the same person. Some do not return at all. Above them, the world is vast and unknowable. Destroyers slice through the sea, listening. Aircraft scour the surface. One ping of sonar, one mistaken breath, and the U-boat may become a tomb. But for now, they are invisible. Steel surrounds them. Not like a shelter, more like a shell. Thin, pressed by water. Inside it, 25 men breathe in unison, and the hatch is closed. Chapter 2. Cramped Steel Tomb. The dive had settled into stillness. Outside the hull, the sea pressed in on all sides, silent and endless. Inside, however, life carried on within a long, narrow body of steel. Not so much a vessel as a sealed corridor suspended in a pressure chamber. The walls did not bend. The ceiling was low. The deck was narrow and uneven, and every inch of space had already been claimed. The first impression a newcomer might have was of closeness, not the cozy kind, but something deeper, something harder to shake. It was a closeness made of proximity, of metal, of warmth, and of constant, unrelenting breath. The air moved but barely. The smell of it had weight, a heavy mixture of sweat, machine oil, diesel residue, must, and slowly decaying food. With nowhere to escape, the odors lingered in every pipe and seam. The corridor running through the U-boat measured barely enough for one man to pass comfortably. To go in opposite directions, two sailors would have to turn sideways, flatten their shoulders, and sometimes step into another compartment altogether. Pipes lined the ceiling, hanging just low enough to catch the forehead of anyone who forgot where they were. Valves protruded from the walls like elbows in a crowded room. And there was never a spot to pause that didn't block someone else. As the boat pressed westward through deeper waters, the crew began to adapt to their new reality, not because they were comfortable, but because adaptation was the only way forward. There was no luxury of denial once the hatch was shut, no room for hesitation. One either fit into the rhythm of life below the surface or risked breaking against it. In the forward torpedo room, 4 great weapons rested silently in their tubes. Beside them, in the slivers of leftover space, 4 bunks were mounted along the walls. Men slept beside explosives, their legs curled into half moons to avoid bumping the torpedo casing. At night, condensation would bead on the tubes and drip onto bedding or onto the sailor's face. There were no curtains for privacy, no soft mattress to sink into. The cots were thin slabs, supported by canvas and steel rods, wedged into the geometry of war. Above the control room, the conning tower formed the brainstem of the boat. Below, sailors stood at their stations, helmsman, plainsman, sonar operator, each man operating in a fixed position no wider than a coffin. They leaned over dials, listening intently to instructions from above or sounds from beyond the hull. The control room never truly slept. Even when the rest of the boat sank into low murmurs or snores, this center remained active, its crew taking turns navigating blind through hostile waters. Beyond the control room, the tight hallway continued aft, leading toward the crew quarters and galley. It was here, in the so-called living section, that the true limits of space became clear. Hammocks were strung over torpedoes. Lockers, no larger than bread boxes, stored a man's entire possessions. Sailors slept shoulder to shoulder, sometimes sharing beds on rotating shifts. The concept of a private moment ceased to exist. Everything had to be shared. The bunk, the toilet, the air. Meals were prepared in a space the size of a broom closet. The cook worked miracles using only 2 electric hot plates and a few battered pots. The refrigerator had been removed long ago to make space for additional batteries. Fresh food, whatever could be carried aboard, was crammed into corners and tied to railings. Boxes of eggs were nestled beside machinery. Bunches of onions hung from hooks. Loaves of rye bread, covered in waxed paper, were stacked under benches and beneath the floorboards. As the patrol wore on, the food would spoil, soften, and mold. But every bite mattered. The crew gathered in 2 shifts for meals. Those off duty would wedge themselves into the galley space or eat standing. Tin plates were passed by hand. Coffee, always lukewarm and bitter, was poured into dented mugs. Conversation during meals was minimal, partly due to the cramped quarters, but also because the noise attracted attention through the hall. Sound discipline was constant. Laughter had to be held in. Yawns had to be silent. Despite the physical closeness, men often felt isolated. There were no windows, no true sense of time passing. Watches changed, bells chimed, yet the difference between morning and night blurred completely. The boat ran on its own schedule. Daylight was a rumor that belonged to the world above. Those who were not on watch found ways to exist in the gaps between duty. A letter from home might be read by torchlight, its edges soft from frequent unfolding. Some men wrote diaries in tiny notebooks, their handwriting shrinking to conserve paper. Others carved initials into their lockers or scratched quiet drawings into the metal bulkhead just beneath their bunks, not as defacement, but as quiet proof that they had lived there, even for a while. The engine room, toward the rear, was the loudest and hottest space aboard. Here, the diesels roared when on the surface and throbbed with a dull heat when submerged. The air was thick with fumes. Oil coated every surface, including the men. Gloves were worn not just for protection, but to avoid burning one's skin on scalding pipes. Steam hissed constantly from joints. The mechanics and machinists worked half naked, their backs blackened with soot, their eyes red from the constant sting of engine gases. In winter, the U-boat's interior remained stifling. In summer, it became nearly unbearable. The temperature throughout the submarine fluctuated with maddening inconsistency. Near the engine room, it could rise to over 35 degrees Celsius. In the forward torpedo compartment, especially during silent running, it might drop to near freezing. The condensation became a constant nuisance. It clung to walls, dripped into ears, soaked through clothes during sleep. The steel skin of the boat, reacting to the temperature of the sea, became a wall of sweating metal. Hygiene, under such conditions, became a distant ideal. Washing was limited to sponge baths with lukewarm water from metal basins. There was no fresh water to waste on comfort. Shaving was sporadic. Haircuts were rare. Most men developed a distinctive odor, a cocktail of sweat, grease, mildew, and the briny scent of their own soaked clothes. No amount of wiping could truly change that. The latrine, located near the bow, was small enough that some larger crewmen had to wedge themselves in sideways to use it. Waste was stored in tanks and periodically flushed overboard, but only at certain depths and conditions. When the pressure was wrong, flushing could backfire, literally, resulting in messes that lingered for days. A common saying on board was that you hadn't served on a U-boat until the toilet betrayed you. Over time, small illnesses spread among the crew, minor infections, rashes, toothaches. Without proper facilities, even a blister could become a threat. There was a medic on board, but his supplies were limited. Antibiotics were rare. Bandages were reused. Everyone hoped not to need him. Sleep, too, was uneven. Watches were divided into 4-hour shifts, but noise and heat often made rest difficult. Even in off-duty hours, the boat throbbed with motion. Electric motors hummed. Pumps clicked. Occasionally, a clank echoed as ballast shifted or a wrench dropped. The ceiling was never far from one's face, and the knowledge that 50 meters of water lay above often crept into dreams. Claustrophobia was not discussed openly. To acknowledge it was to give it power. Yet most men had moments where the boat felt tighter than usual, when the air seemed thinner, or the hallway longer, or the bulkheads closer together. It was said that after enough time submerged, even the strongest will could buckle if not distracted. This is why routine was sacred. This is why drills were constant. Order was not just military discipline, it was survival of the mind. There were a few reliefs. Once every couple of weeks, the boat might surface under cover of night to air out. Hatches would open, and fresh Atlantic wind would rush in like a forgotten gift. Faces would lift to the stars, jackets would flap. Some men wept in silence, breathing deeply. Others stood on the deck, gazing at the waves, not speaking, just listening to the sound of nothing, the absence of walls, the absence of steel. But such moments were brief. The hatch would close again. The red lights would return, and the tight warren of corridors would reclaim them. Inside the U-boat, the crew returned always to the same cycle: watch, eat, sleep, stand by, drill. Over and over. Time passed as a blur. Beards grew without notice. Personality shrank into routine. The body adjusted to hardship, but the mind never quite did. And through it all, the steel tomb moved forward, silent and unseen, a needle slipping through the ocean's blue skin. Chapter 3: Scent of the Sea and Men. Long before the crew could see the enemy, long before depth charges rattled the hull or sonar pings echoed through the silence, the first enemy to surround them was odor. It arrived early, crept in quietly, and never left. By the second day submerged, the U-boat had begun to shed its steel sterility and take on the unmistakable smell of the men living inside it. There was no single source. The scent was a mixture, thick and layered, shaped by time, temperature, and the slow accumulation of human presence in an airtight world. Sweat was the foundation. It clung to everybody, soaked into shirts, gathered in boots, and dripped from brows as the heat rose. In the tight confines of the submarine, even a small amount of perspiration had nowhere to go. It lingered in the fibers of clothing, in canvas bunk covers, in wool socks left to dry above the torpedoes. Over days and weeks, that sweat fermented quietly, baking into the fabric of the boat itself. Then came the grease, not the grease of food, but of engines and machinery. The scent of oil saturated the engine room and spread slowly forward, clinging to the hands and hair of every sailor who passed through. It mingled with the air, left streaks on handrails, and gave a permanent gloss to the sleeves of worn uniforms. The engine room mechanics carried it most heavily. Their clothes turned shiny and dark. Their skin, stained and leathery, gave off a heat and smell like scorched rubber mixed with old diesel. Beside this came the odors of food, or more accurately, the slow decay of food. At the beginning of the patrol, the air was touched by the sweetness of fresh onions and bread. Loaves were tied up in wax paper and stacked in the narrow walking spaces. Root vegetables filled canvas sacks that swung gently with the motion of the hull. Sausages were hung from pipes, cured and dried, their smell sharp and fatty. For a day or two, it might have resembled a makeshift pantry. But the warmth inside the submarine, paired with moisture from condensation, created the perfect environment for rot. Bread grew soft and then green. Potatoes sprouted in the dark. Onions collapsed in their skins. Canned meat gave off metallic tangs when opened. By the second week, the scent of decay followed every meal. Not enough to halt eating, never that, but enough to stain the air around the galley with a sour heaviness. There was no refrigerator. Every bite was consumed with the knowledge that it had begun to spoil the moment it was loaded on board. The cook did what he could. He salted heavily, added strong mustard, cooked quickly. But masking the truth of the food's age was impossible. And when he boiled vegetables, the steam filled the surrounding compartments with a humid cloud of bitter sweetness that clung to the ceiling like fog. The smell of men's bodies never weakened. In fact, as days passed without proper washing, the scent grew denser. Showers did not exist aboard the U-boat. Washing involved a cloth, a basin of lukewarm water, and a cramped space beside the toilet. There was little fresh water to spare, so it was mostly wiped skin, rarely scrubbed. Soap was used sparingly and often shared between men. Towels, once damp, took days to dry. Some crewmen avoided washing altogether, preferring to let the dirt build as a kind of armor. Underarms carried the sharp tang of salt and fatigue. Feet, packed into wool socks and boots for 18 hours at a stretch, gave off a sour musk that filled the bunks when boots were removed. Breath grew stale. Teeth were brushed less and less as the patrol went on. The small mirror fixed near the galley sink showed cheeks hollowing, beards thickening, eyes losing their shine. The toilet, a narrow chamber the size of a closet, became a battleground. There was only one functioning head aboard, located toward the bow. Men waited in line during surface runs, hoping for a chance before the next dive. Its smell could not be contained by a closed door. Each flush required a complex series of valve turns, which, if done improperly, caused waste to back up and flood into the floor grates. When that happened, the stench filled the forward compartments for days. No amount of scrubbing could remove the memory. Air was filtered, but only partially. The system was primitive. Scrubbers removed some carbon dioxide, but odors passed through easily. After a week, the smell was no longer a warning. It became part of the boat's identity. No one commented on it. No one complained. They simply breathed it in and moved on. Some tried to counter it. A few men carried tins of menthol salve, which they rubbed beneath their noses during particularly bad stretches. Others chewed cloves or bits of licorice, not for flavor but to push back the taste of mildew in the air. The captain had a small bottle of cologne he dabbed under his collar once a week, not to cover the smell, but to remember something cleaner. Yet there were moments, always unspoken, when the scent crossed into discomfort. When a man fell ill, his sweat turned sour and noticeable. When someone vomited from seasickness, the odor spread fast and stayed long. If the weather turned and the boat pitched for hours, the collective nausea gave rise to an atmosphere thick with stomach acid and unwashed bodies. And when the toilet overflowed, it became a whole body assault. There was no corner to retreat to, no window to open, just the reek of waste clinging to everything and everyone. Fatigue amplified the affect. As sleep became harder to come by, the crew's tolerance weakened. A shoulder brushing past in the corridor brought with it the greasy imprint of body heat and clothing soaked in weeks of effort. Even breathing became labor. The air was heavy. At times it tasted of copper and mold. On the rare occasions the U-boat surfaced for fresh air, it was as if a veil lifted. Hatches would swing open, and sailors would climb the conning tower just to fill their lungs with something clean. The salt of the Atlantic, sharp and wild, rushed in and swept away the worst of the rot, but only briefly. Within minutes, the steel shell began to reclaim its atmosphere. It wasn't just unpleasant. The smell could be dangerous. When the boat was silent and submerged, any human sound or smell could betray them. Leaks of cooking aromas through the snorkel could be detected by nearby ships. This led to cooking bans during silent running. No onions, no frying. Even tea had to be brewed with care. The tension around odor grew during depth charge attacks. When the boat went still and the engines powered down, any shift in the atmosphere became noticeable. A man sweating in fear had a different smell, sharper, more metallic. A crewman praying in silence might still give off the scent of adrenaline. The boat recorded all of it. In moments of high pressure, odors seemed to cling more fiercely to the skin. The steel hull itself seemed to soak them in. Bunks grew rank with shared use. Blankets went unchanged. No one dared raise the issue. To speak of it was to risk drawing attention, or worse, being seen as soft. Letters from home sometimes brought the opposite effect. A scented handkerchief tucked between folded pages, a pressed flower sealed in wax. These small traces of a world beyond metal reminded the crew that air could once smell like lavender or pine. For a moment, the submarine's odor disappeared, but it always came back. Every man smelled it differently. Some noticed the mildew above all else. Others focused on the diesel or the acid scent of the battery room. Some said the boat always smelled of rust and rubber. But most agreed, the U-boat had a soul and its breath was human. After weeks underwater, the distinction between self and environment blurred. A man could no longer tell where his own scent ended and the boat's began. Clothes became second skin. Beds absorbed personalities. Even boots began to feel like part of the floor. This intimacy with odor became its own kind of bond. Shared discomfort. Mutual survival. A wordless acknowledgement that they were enduring something no one on land could quite understand. And still, the patrol continued. Chapter 4. Meals in the Depths. Food aboard a German U-boat was never just about nutrition. It was ritual, morale, necessity, and often disappointment. It marked the hours in a place where clocks meant little. It soothed when it could. It offended when it spoiled. And every man aboard, regardless of rank or duty, knew that each meal was one of the only constants during the long weeks at sea. From the moment the hatch was sealed, the U-boat became a closed ecosystem. Nothing could be added, nothing removed, and food began a slow decline from its freshest point toward inevitability. Every morsel had to be planned in advance, measured, stored, rotated, and accounted for. It was not just about how much was brought aboard. It was about how long it could last. The loading process before departure was methodical, even strategic. Dozens of crates and sacks were hauled down through the narrow hatches by hand, passed man to man through the conning tower and down the central corridor. There was no dedicated storage room. Every possible inch of the boat, beneath bunks, under floor grates, behind bulkheads, became a pantry. Fresh bread was wrapped in waxed paper and stacked in cloth-lined bins. Boxes of eggs were wedged between instrument panels. Onions were strung like garlands and hung from hooks above torpedo tubes. Potatoes were kept in canvas sacks that rested in damp corners near the bow. Sausages, smoked and dry, swung gently from overhead piping in the crew quarters. Canned goods made up the bulk of the diet and were secured tightly in netting along the walls and ceilings. The cook, usually just one man, knew every hiding place by heart. He didn't just prepare meals. He was the ship's archivist of perishable memory. He knew which sack of potatoes had begun to sprout. He remembered which crate of cabbages had already started to soften. He could tell by touch how many eggs were still usable, and by smell, which tin of meat had turned before its label said it should. The galley was impossibly small. No wider than a hallway, it held 2 electric hot plates, a short counter, a rack of hanging utensils, and a basin no larger than a helmet. There was no oven, no cold storage, no room for a second man. The cook worked standing still, sometimes unable to fully turn around. He wore an apron stained with grease and vegetable juice, and a towel always hung over his shoulder. Meals were prepared 3 times a day, though day was a concept that bent with the needs of the watch schedule. Breakfasts were usually simple: black bread, a smear of margarine, perhaps a slice of sausage if it was still good. Coffee, bitter and dark, was brewed in dented kettles and passed down the line in chipped mugs. There was no sugar. Occasionally, there was jam. Those days were remembered. Lunch might include boiled potatoes with sauerkraut, or canned meat warmed in a pan and served with pickled vegetables. On special days, perhaps a birthday or after surfacing from a dangerous run, the cook might offer pea soup thickened with leftover bread, or a noodle stew made from whatever he had left within reach. Dinner was often lighter: crackers with tinned cheese, tea, weak and metallic, a few slices of cold sausage, or a bit of salted herring. It was not indulgent, it was simply enough. The men ate in 2 groups, alternating by watch. There was no dining area. Plates were held in laps or rested on the tops of crates. The smell of food filled the air and drifted through the compartments, which was both comforting and irritating, depending on one's hunger. Conversation during meals was limited, not forbidden, just naturally subdued. The act of eating in such a tight space, pressed between equipment and elbows, did not invite leisure. Forks and spoons were often mismatched. Napkins didn't exist. Cloth was too valuable. Most men wiped their mouths on their sleeves or not at all. The sound of eating, quiet chewing, the clink of a cup against metal, the scrape of a spoon became part of the submarine soundtrack. As the days wore on, the quality of food declined predictably. Bread grew stale by the second week. Mold arrived soon after, first as pale flecks, then in streaks of green. It was trimmed away, and the rest was eaten. Eggs, kept unrefrigerated, began to sweat in their shells. They were used quickly, prioritized in every breakfast until the last one was cracked into a pan with a hiss and a silent farewell. Potatoes softened, then shriveled. Carrots went limp and dark. Cabbage, a rare luxury, turned sour and rank. When the rot became too much, the spoiled items were tossed out the hatch during surface runs at night. One by one, dropped like dead ballast into the sea. The canned goods, meat, fish, beans, condensed milk, were the most reliable, but they too held risks. Swollen cans were a red flag. The contents might have turned poisonous. Still, on a hungry day, some were opened anyway. A sniff test was performed. If no one flinched, it was served. No one wanted to admit how much they depended on food that came with a gamble. The cook bore the weight of it all. When men were irritable, they blamed the meals. When morale dropped, they looked to him for comfort. And yet, he had no miracles to offer. Only rationed ingredients in an unsteady hot plate. There was no refrigeration. Everything was shelf-stable or dried or cured. Butter melted and separated within days. Cheese softened and smelled sharp. Meats sweated in their waxed paper. Drinks were limited to water, tea, and coffee. Occasionally, a small bottle of schnapps was passed around during a birthday or holiday, each man taking a sip in silence before passing it on. Clean water was precious. Stored in tanks along the hull, it was rationed not only for drinking, but for cooking and washing. Sometimes, after long patrols, the water turned brackish from bacterial growth. Boiling helped. So did tea. But on many days, the taste of rust and mold clung to every cup. Waste disposal was an ever-present challenge. Food scraps were saved when possible to be dumped overboard during silent surface intervals. But when those moments didn't come, bins filled up. The smell of old cabbage and spoiled fat joined the permanent bouquet of life in the depths. Despite the grim conditions, meals remained sacred. They broke the day into manageable sections. They gave men something to look forward to. Even a boiled potato with a slice of sausage felt like an anchor in time, proof that life continued on some kind of track. Letters from home often referenced food, a wife describing roast duck on a Sunday, or a mother mentioning apple cake cooling on a window ledge. These memories burned in the mind. Sailors would whisper to each other about what they missed most. Fresh rolls, hot milk, cold beer, cherries in summer. The act of remembering food became a comfort all its own. During depth charge attacks, meals were forgotten. The galley went silent. Plates were left untouched. The cook sat on his stool and waited, hands folded, as the boat rocked and shuddered. Later, if they were lucky, he would reheat what remained, and the men would eat in a daze, chewing slowly, eyes unfocused. No one went hungry by design. Rations were carefully calculated to last the length of the patrol. But when a mission ran long, when extra days were added to a return journey, when delays forced extra dives, the food was stretched thinner. Portions shrank. Bread was split more finely. Water was diluted. The cook did what he could, but mathematics always won. Sometimes the men joked about it. They nicknamed dishes after luxuries: Atlantic steak for canned pork, depth charge delight for reheated beans. But no one truly laughed. The humor was thin, a wall against despair. And yet, when the boat surfaced after weeks below and the hatch opened to the salt air, when they stepped onto a dock and smelled frying onions from a street vendor, when they took that first bite of warm bread that had never seen the inside of a can, it was then they remembered what real food was. Until then, they endured. They sat cross-legged beside torpedoes, holding metal plates in oily hands, and ate quietly, one spoonful at a time. Chapter 5. The Watch Begins. There was no sunrise in the deep, no window to glance at, no sky to read, no warmth to hint at morning. In a world of endless metal and machinery, time was measured not by light but by duty. The U-boat did not sleep. It did not rest. It moved, breathed, and waited, always alert, always watching. And so did the men who lived inside it. From the first day submerged, the crew slipped into a rhythm dictated not by nature, but by necessity. Life aboard the submarine revolved around a system of rotating watches, each one carefully measured in hours, but felt differently by every man enduring them. These watches were not flexible. They formed the spine of survival. Shifts were assigned with precision, and failure to show up on time was not an option. Not because of punishment, but because someone's life, or everyone's life, might depend on that post being manned. Typically, the day was divided into 6 watches of 4 hours each. The cycle ran continuously, with no regard for weekends, holidays, or birthdays. The schedule might begin with a man standing the midnight to 4 a.m. watch, then resting until noon, before taking the 4 p.m. to 8 p.m. shift later that same day. It was a rhythm that challenged the body's natural instincts, forcing men to sleep in short bursts, nap when they could, and function during moments when the body longed most for rest. The watch system created a constant buzz of movement. Even during the quietest hours, someone was always awake. Someone was at the helm, adjusting course in fractions of degrees. Someone stood at the hydrophone station, listening through thick headphones for the faint pulse of enemy screws. Someone monitored the batteries, checked the bilge pumps, watched for pressure changes in the ballast tanks. Each task came with its own demands. Some required silence and perfect stillness. Others demanded speed and instinct. All required attention, an unbroken thread of awareness woven through the noise of the boat and the sleep-starved haze of a man's own thoughts. In the control room, the helm watch rotated in pairs. One man adjusted the depth planes, maintaining the submarine's pitch as it moved through the sea. The other monitored the rudder, steering the long steel body with subtle pressure on the wheel. Every few minutes, depth gauges were checked, bearings confirmed, and engine output logged. Conversation was minimal. Instructions were spoken softly and without hesitation. The hydrophone operator had one of the most important jobs in the silent running state. Using sensitive underwater microphones, he listened for any foreign sound, merchant propellers, destroyer screws, even the distinct rhythm of aircraft engines above the waves. His headphones were heavy. The rubber padding left marks on his temples after each shift. He often sat alone in the dark, eyes closed, surrounded by the throb of the boat's own systems, trying to isolate the whispers of distant threats. The battery technician working farther aft monitored the heartbeat of the submarine. When submerged, the vessel relied entirely on stored power. Each surge of electricity had to be tracked. Overcharging risked heat and fire. Undervoltage could mean a blackout, leaving the crew blind and deaf in the Black Sea. His watch was quiet, but it was pressure-laden, demanding constant calculation and foresight. Men on watch rarely stood still for long. There were valves to check, leaks to wipe, condensation to mop from the walls. In the engine room, even when the diesel motors were quiet, the mechanic's eyes never left the pressure gauges. Oil flow had to be measured, fuel lines inspected. A single unnoticed drop could grow into disaster. The machinery required loyalty. It offered no forgiveness. The cook, though not officially assigned to a watch, lived on his own schedule, which often felt like a watch of its own. He rose early to prepare breakfast before the first crew rotation and remained active late into the night reheating meals for the late shift. His duty was as constant as the navigator's, feeding the living engine of the men inside the hull. Sleep came in fragments. The crew learned to drift into rest when possible, curling into narrow bunks or slumping against warm pipes. 4 hours might be broken into 2, or even less, interrupted by sudden drills or depth changes. There was no room for uninterrupted slumber. Men learned to close their eyes the moment their heads hit the pillow, whether their minds were ready or not. The air in the sleeping quarters was heavy. Sweat from the previous occupant clung to the mattress. A faint odor of diesel always lingered, no matter how many times the blankets were aired. But fatigue overruled discomfort. When the body demanded sleep, it took what it could get. Dreams were fractured. Some men saw lightless corridors stretching forever. Others relived surfacing drills or torpedo launches. Many dreamt of home, not in color or detail, but in sensation. The smell of a bakery, the creak of floorboards, a mother's voice calling from another room. These flickers vanished quickly on waking, replaced by the throb of machinery and the press of steel overhead. Fatigue did not arrive like a wave. It seeped in slowly. After a week submerged, faces grew slack, eyes dulled, reactions slowed. The humor that passed between crewmates became thinner, less spontaneous. The smallest irritations grew teeth. A misplaced tool, a missed handoff at shift change, a mess left in the galley. These things, minor on land, became sources of friction inside the U-boat. The captain watched for signs. He paid attention to the walk of a man who normally moved briskly, but now shuffled. He listened for the tone of a reply that sounded just a bit too sharp. It was his job to know when someone was nearing the edge. Discipline remained strict, but not without mercy. Sometimes he reassigned men temporarily, moved a hydrophone operator to a maintenance task, let a sleep-deprived machinist swap a shift with a younger sailor. The goal was balance, not punishment. The monotony of watches was broken only by drills, briefings, and the occasional threat. When sonar pings echoed through the hull, the watch was no longer routine. Every man stood a little straighter. Hands hovered near controls. The submarine shifted from sleepwalk to readiness. Drills were run without warning. Fire, flooding, hull breach. Each crewman had an assigned role, and the rehearsal was timed. Hatches were sealed. Valves closed. Reports shouted. Even in drills, the heart beat faster. The boundary between exercise and emergency was thin, especially for those new to the boat. Over time, the watch system dissolved personal time. No man could say with confidence what day it was. The calendar became irrelevant. Birthdays passed without candles or cards. Holidays were remembered only if someone brought it up quietly, in passing, like a distant weather report. The only thing that mattered was the next watch, when it began, where it took place, and whether the body could endure another rotation. Off-watch hours were precious, but rarely restful. Men read when they could. A few wrote short entries in notebooks, trying to mark the passage of time with ink. Others lay in their bunks and stared at the pipes above them, counting drips of condensation until sleep arrived or the bell called them again. Music was rare. Radios were used sparingly to avoid detection. Once in a while, during surface runs, the crew might pick up a faint signal, a scratchy waltz, a piece of military news, a woman's voice reading letters aloud to a distant audience. These sounds were cherished, not for content, but for what they represented: a world above, still spinning, still singing, still unaware of the silence below. The longer the patrol stretched, the more the watches bled together. A man might forget which shift he had just finished. Meals began to taste the same. The boat's temperature, always warm and damp, stopped being noticed. The body entered a state of persistence, not thriving, but continuing. Despite the burden, the watches created bonds. The same men shared the same shifts, day after day. They learned each other's rhythms. One might bring a tin cup of tea for his partner at the hydrophones. Another might take the helm early to give a friend a few extra minutes of rest. These small kindnesses never needed to be spoken aloud. They were understood. Occasionally, tragedy or accident would disrupt the cycle. An injury, a bout of fever. In those moments, the schedule flexed. Others filled in. The rhythm faltered, then repaired itself. The boat had no room for extended weakness. It carried on because it had to. For the youngest crew members, the watches were a test of will. They learned not just how to perform tasks, but how to endure in silence, how to keep their minds steady when the hours seemed endless, how to stay alert even when their bones ached for sleep. There were no medals for completing a shift, no celebration for staying awake, only the knowledge that the submarine still moved, that the lights still hummed, that the enemy had not found them, at least not yet. And so, with quiet footsteps and whispered handoffs, the watches began and ended, over and over, in the belly of the steel coffin. Chapter 6. The Pressure Mounts. Beneath the waves, silence became a way of life. It was not the silence of peace, nor the stillness of calm water on a quiet morning. It was a different kind of silence, a deliberate, tense quiet that stretched across every inch of the U-boat, coiling like a wire inside each man's chest. This silence did not soothe. It warned. In the early days of the patrol, the silence had weight, but not menace. The crew moved through the routines of submerged life with discipline. They were alert, aware of their environment, but not yet burdened by it. The ocean above felt distant, and though they knew danger existed, it remained theoretical, a charted possibility, not an immediate presence. But as the patrol wore on, that began to change. The pressure built gradually, like the water around them. Not in sudden spikes, but in a slow, unrelenting rise. It came from many directions. Some of it came from the physical confinement, the steel walls that never yielded, the narrow corridors that offered no retreat, the oppressive heat that turned every breath into labor. But more than that, it came from not knowing what waited above. The enemy was always just beyond hearing. Every sonar ping, every faint vibration, every mechanical murmur carried with it the question, was someone listening? The ocean no longer felt vast, it felt crowded. full of predators. The men had no way of knowing when they were being hunted, only that eventually they would be. At first, the tension manifested in small ways. A shift in posture, a laugh that sounded forced, meals eaten more quickly, fewer letters read aloud, fewer jokes passed between bunks. The usual banter that helped ease the burden of life underwater began to dry up. No one planned it. It just happened. The hydrophone operator, once calm and detached, began to flinch at unexpected sounds. He listened harder. His shoulders tensed as he adjusted the volume, pressing the headphones tighter. One night, he reported hearing the faint churn of a destroyer's propellers, slow, steady, unmistakable. The boat went silent at once. All hands to stations. Cooking stopped. Lights were dimmed. Hatches were sealed. The U-boat drifted quietly, submerged and still, like prey. They waited for hours. Nothing came. No depth charges. No follow-up pings. Just stillness. Eventually, the all-clear was given, but the crew didn't truly relax. The pressure remained invisible and persistent. Each encounter, real or imagined, added a new layer of anxiety. The men trusted the sonar, the charts, and their captain, but nerves had a way of bypassing reason. Even in moments of relative safety, the atmosphere inside the boat grew heavier. No one said it aloud, but everyone knew they were gambling with each passing hour. The psychological weight was most evident in the way the men carried themselves. Backs hunched lower, eyes darted more quickly. Tempers, once carefully managed, began to show. A snapped comment over a shared bunk, a disagreement about watch rotations, a moment of hesitation during a drill. These things added up. The captain watched carefully. He had seen this before, the quiet unraveling of a crew under stress. It rarely exploded. It wore down instead. Fatigue didn't just come from lack of sleep. It came from the mind's constant calculation of risk, from wondering whether the next day would bring surfacing or sinking, from the growing suspicion that someone, somewhere, might already be tracking them. Depth played a role too. As the submarine descended to avoid detection, the pressure of the sea increased. The hull creaked more audibly. Groans echoed through the compartments like the sighs of something massive and indifferent. Bolts popped faintly. Metal strained. Men became acutely aware of how thin the steel was between them and collapse. The deeper the boat went, the more compressed the world became. Sound changed. Movement slowed. Even speech seemed quieter, as if the water itself was listening. Some crewmen developed rituals to manage the strain. One man always tapped the same sequence on the side of his bunk before sleeping. Another kept a folded letter from home in his pocket, touching it before each shift. A machinist, quiet and steady, whispered the names of his children while he worked, barely audible over the thrum of the motors. These rituals didn't solve the fear, but they helped contain it. They gave the illusion of control in a place where most things could not be controlled. But not all men managed well. One crewman, young and recently assigned, began to withdraw. He ate less, spoke rarely. His eyes never settled. At first, others gave him space. They understood. Everyone struggled. But after several days, his behavior worsened. He failed to respond to orders during a drill. He left his bunk during a silent period, creating noise that echoed through the hull. His bunkmate found him sitting in the galley at 3 a.m, staring at the cold stove, not blinking. The captain intervened, quietly, without punishment. The man was reassigned to menial tasks, kept in communal areas, spoken to softly and often. The crew adapted around him. They knew he was not weak, just overwhelmed. Everyone had been close to that edge at least once. The fear inside a U-boat did not always come from explosions. More often, it came from silence that lingered too long, from orders not yet given, from the feeling of being watched, even when logically it made no sense. The brain, deprived of sunlight and comfort, began to fill in its own threats. This mental pressure manifested physically. Heartbeats quickened without cause. Hands trembled after long shifts. Dreams turned darker. One crewman admitted, during a brief moment of calm, that he had started to feel as though the boat itself was alive, that it breathed, and that its breath was not always friendly. He laughed afterward, embarrassed. But no one dismissed him. In such conditions, command decisions became weightier. The captain faced choices that no manual could prepare him for. When to dive, when to surface, whether to chase a convoy or avoid detection, whether to act aggressively or remain hidden. Every command risked the lives of the entire crew. He bore that knowledge silently. There were times when orders had to be reversed mid-action, when they began to surface and caught radar signals, when they lined up for a torpedo launch but found an escort turning too quickly. In those moments, the pressure spiked. Men had to adapt instantly. Muscles tensed, eyes locked on gauges. Every movement carried the knowledge that one wrong button, one delayed reaction could be fatal. In the rare moments they did fire a torpedo, the wait for impact was agonizing. After launch, there was only silence. The crew held their breath. 1, 2, 3, waiting to hear the detonation. If it came, it brought relief and dread at once. The enemy might be gone or returning fire. If no sound followed, they feared they had missed, revealed their position for nothing. Depth charges were the worst. The first explosion always came without warning. A dull boom, followed by a ripple through the metal skin of the boat. The lights flickered. The air felt sucked from the room. Then came another, closer. The hull groaned. Dust fell from the ceiling. Men grabbed whatever was near to brace themselves. In those moments, the boat became a tomb in waiting. Every creak, every snap, every echo was analyzed. Damage was assessed instinctively, the way a sailor might know if a leak was serious just by smell. Men at their stations became statues. Breathing slowed, not by instruction, but by fear. When the attack ended, if it ended, the silence returned heavier than before. The crew exhaled. Some cried silently. No one judged them. Even afterward, the pressure lingered. Some men drank deeply from their canteens. Others lay in their bunks and stared upward. The cook, always the quiet witness, brewed weak tea for anyone who came through the galley. No words were needed. They shared the tea, shared the glances, shared the silence. Despite all of this, the boat continued its patrol. The pressure never vanished. It became part of the background, like the thrum of the engines or the sway of the hull. The men learned to carry it, not without effort, not without scars, but with the knowledge that survival depended on it. Above them, the sea rolled on, unaware. And still the U-boat moved forward, silent, steel-bound, and full of breath that refused to break. Chapter 7. Voices in the Metal. In the beginning, the submarine seemed quiet. The world outside was hushed, layers of water above and below, sound absorbed by the sea. There were no birds calling, no wind howling, no footsteps, laughter, or distant music. The silence at first felt peaceful, but that illusion did not last. The U-boat was never truly silent. It had its own language, and it spoke constantly. Beneath the surface, the steel hull became a drum, not one that rang with rhythm, but one that moaned, sighed, and warned. The submarine groaned with every shift of depth. Pipes thumped softly as pressure built. Metal plates expanded and contracted, echoing faintly in the corridors like footsteps just out of sight. At first, the crew took note of each new sound. A creak from the stern, a hiss near the ballast tank, a low rumble from the electric motors. They cataloged these noises mentally, not out of curiosity, but necessity. Every sound carried meaning, and often danger. The hull itself was the most vocal. As the boat dove deeper, it began to speak in strained murmurs. Long, low groans rolled along the walls, like a deep breath held too long. Sharp, sudden pops came from rivets settling under pressure. These noises were part of every descent. They never indicated failure, but they reminded everyone aboard just how thin the steel barrier was between life and the crushing weight of the sea. For the new crew members, these sounds were unsettling. They listened with wide eyes, asking in whispers whether something was wrong. The veterans gave quiet reassurances. This was normal. The boat always spoke when diving. The creaks and groans were signs that she was alive and holding. But reassurance could only go so far. In the dark, with no sky above, even a normal noise could feel like the start of catastrophe. Not all sounds were mechanical. Some came from the crew. A cough echoing in the torpedo room. A pair of boots scraping the deck. The clink of a spoon and a tin cup. In a place where space was limited and tension constant, these human sounds were as much part of the environment as the thrum of the battery fans. And then there were the leaks. No U-boat was perfectly dry. Condensation formed on every pipe, collected in corners, ran in rivulets down walls. But sometimes the sound of dripping water took on a new tone, a sharper drop, a faster rhythm. The engineers paid close attention to these changes. A new leak could mean a crack forming, a seal weakening, a valve slipping. Every drip was a potential warning. The crew learned to hear differently. They tuned out some sounds, focused intensely on others. In the engine room, men worked amid near-deafening hums, yet could still pick out the change in pitch when a motor strained. In the control room, a slight change in airflow was noted and logged. Near the galley, a sudden stop in the water pump brought immediate inspection. Then there was the hydrophone room, the listening station. The man stationed there wore thick headphones and sat in near total darkness. He listened not to the submarine, but to the world outside. His task was simple in theory, but critical in practice, to detect any sound that did not belong. Propellers from merchant ships, the high-pitched whine of sonar pings, the rumble of depth charges before detonation. He recorded what he heard in shorthand on a clipboard strapped to his leg. Long dashes meant heavy ships. Dots marked the rapid cadence of an approaching destroyer. A blank page meant a quiet ocean, the most welcome sound of all. But he heard more than machines. Whales sang through the darkness. Deep moans, rising whistles. Sometimes close, sometimes far. Other sea creatures passed too. Clicks, grunts, strange rattles. No one could say for certain what all of them were. Most were ignored. Some were noted. A few were discussed later in hushed tones. One operator claimed he had once heard another submarine passing beneath them. Not seen, not tracked, but heard. The engine signature was faint. The rhythm was wrong for any surface ship. He logged it, but there was no confirmation. The boat passed them by, if it was there at all. Still, the crew listened more closely for days afterward. The scariest sounds were the ones that arrived without warning. A sudden, metallic shriek from below the floor, a wrench slipping and clattering across a grating, a scream that turned out to be nothing more than a pipe shifting with the change in ballast, a hammering thump that echoed through the hull, caused by a shifting crate in the food storage. Every one of these incidents brought a moment of panic. Everyone sent men to their stations, waiting for confirmation of an attack. Silence, in those moments, became the most terrifying sound of all. After a loud noise, the hush that followed stretched too long. Everyone waited to hear something else. The hiss of an air vent, a voice on the intercom, anything. If nothing came, the silence grew heavier, more alive. There were superstitions. Some men believed that the submarine had modes, that the way the metal creaked meant something more, as if it was warning them. When the hull groaned in certain ways, they took it as a sign to stay quiet. When the air vents hissed erratically, they stayed close to their bunks. None of these beliefs were logical, but in a place ruled by pressure and luck, logic did not always hold. The galley kettle, when left too long on the burner, would whistle faintly. The noise carried through the sleeping quarters. More than once, it startled men from sleep. The cook learned to remove it early, pouring the hot water into thermoses instead. At night, if night could be said to exist, the sounds shifted. Without drills or equipment checks, the boat quieted. But quiet never meant silence. Men snored. Valves ticked. The steel hull flexed subtly with the motion of the sea. The submarine had a pulse, not a steady beat, but a living, shifting rhythm. It thudded faintly beneath the feet. It echoed through the bunk frames. A kind of music, if one learned to hear it. On the worst days, after depth charges had rocked the boat and everyone's nerves were frayed, the echoes became more than just background. They became voices. Not literal, not audible in words, but voices nonetheless. A kind of whisper that slid along the pipes, crawled through the ventilation, settled in the ears of the exhausted. No one said it aloud. But when a man jolted awake, wide-eyed and sweating, no one asked questions. They knew what he had heard. They had heard it too. These voices weren't ghosts. They were the echoes of everything held in fear, exhaustion, tension. The boat did not create them. The men did. But inside steel walls, echoes had nowhere to go. They bounced, multiplied, and returned. Some tried to counter the sounds. A few carried pocket radios, used during surface intervals to bring music into the hull. Others tapped Morse code to each other through bunks. Not messages, just rhythm. A game to remind themselves of the world outside. The captain approved, within reason. Morale mattered. Anything that kept men grounded was allowed, but mostly they endured. The U-boat spoke. The men listened. They responded with routine, inspections, maintenance, notes on clipboards. Each task a way to remind themselves that noise meant the boat was alive, and that life, even hard, was better than the alternative. When they surfaced, the soundscape changed dramatically. Wind, waves, the call of distant gulls, the slap of water against the hull. These noises reminded them of earth, of sky, of air that moved freely. They inhaled deeply. They listened with closed eyes. But surfacing never lasted. Orders came. The dive was ordered, and the metal mouth closed again. Back inside, the sounds resumed. The drip, the hum, the sigh of the hull, and beneath it all, the steady, quiet voice of pressure. Chapter 8. Silent Running. The order came without drama. A quiet word passed from the captain, through the control room, and down the line. Silent running. No bezrang. No whistles blew. There was no shouted command, no clamor of boots to stations. Just a change in air pressure, a slight pause in breath, and then motion slowed. Like a great creature holding still in the deep, the U-boat obeyed. Lights dimmed further, slipping from red to a near amber glow. Fans were powered down. pumps, except the essential few, were halted. The thrum of life aboard the vessel sank into a low, cautious hum. The silence was not absolute, but it was cultivated, shaped by necessity, sharpened by fear. To the crew, the transition was immediate. Every movement became smaller. Every word, if spoken at all, was whispered close to the ear. Doors were not closed, they were nudged gently until they rested in place. Feet were planted carefully, soles of boots placed heel to toe with deliberate care. In a space already tight, every decibel mattered. Outside the hull, the sea remained still. But above, there might be listeners. Silent running was never declared without reason. It meant that danger had crept near, that an enemy ship, a destroyer perhaps, had entered the perimeter. It meant hydrophone operators had heard the change in pitch, a sharper propeller beat, a clearer sonar pulse. Sometimes it came after the first ping. Sometimes the silence began before the sound arrived, based on instinct, not confirmation. Inside the U-boat, the effect was profound. All unnecessary systems were shut down to eliminate vibration. The electric motors remained on, but reduced to minimal output. Every mechanical action was a liability. Even the air scrubbers were adjusted, producing a noticeable change in the smell of the compartment. The air grew denser, slightly metallic, as though the boat itself had begun to sweat. Cooking was forbidden. The burner in the galley sat cold. No soup, no tea, no hot water. The clink of utensils, the boil of water, the scrape of ladles, these sounds could travel. The cook sat in the corner, arms crossed, waiting like everyone else. Crew routines changed instantly. No cleaning, no writing, no shaving. Even personal tasks were paused. Every man took his place and waited. Those on watch remained at their posts with even greater stillness. Those off duty lay silently in their bunks, staring at the pipes above them, listening to the faint shifts in the boat's metal skin. There was no speaking unless absolutely necessary. Instructions were given by hand signals when possible. When speech was required, it came in soft, low tones, words chosen carefully to avoid repetition or excess. A nod replaced a sentence. A look was enough. What struck the newcomers most was how practiced it all was. The silence had been rehearsed. It was not panic. It was ritual. These were not men frozen in fear. They were trained to become part of the submarine's silence. Each breath was timed with the boat's slow, careful glide through the water. Time became distorted. During silent running, clocks ticked slowly. A 4-hour watch stretched into something longer, perhaps not in minutes, but in sensation. Without the background thrum of fans and machinery, the creaks and whispers of the hull grew louder. The drip of condensation was no longer a background noise. It became a metronome. Even the sounds of bodies became distractions. A stomach growling, a throat clearing, the shift of fabric against steel. Each of these registered as intrusive. Men learned to suppress them. They tightened their cores to stifle digestion. They drank water only in small sips. They shifted positions with the care of dancers. Every gesture was deliberate. Nothing happened by accident. In some ways, the silence was beautiful. There was a strange clarity to it, a purity of environment. The crew became attuned to things easily missed during ordinary running. The way the boat flexed when changing depth. The subtle shift in ballast when moving starboard. The faint tick of a pressure gauge just before it clicked over. But it was not a peaceful silence. It was the silence of prey. Above them, sonar might be sweeping the ocean floor. Depth charges could be readied on deck. Listening devices might be focused downward, hungry for the smallest irregularity. The crew had to believe they were quieter than the water itself. The captain stood motionless beside the helm, watching the gauges. He spoke only to the first officer, and even then, with little more than a raised eyebrow or a finger moved across the chart. Decisions made during silent running carried enormous weight. One mistake could bring death in minutes. Sometimes the danger passed quickly. A ship moved on, uninterested or unaware. The crew exhaled slowly. Systems powered up one by one. The fans resumed. The lights brightened. Speech returned, cautiously at first, then with growing confidence. A pot of coffee was brewed. Bread was passed out. The world inside the boat returned. Other times, the silence stretched for hours. In those cases, the psychological weight began to bear down. The knowledge that they were being hunted, perhaps blindly, perhaps directly, changed the air in the submarine. Fear became a smell, a taste, not in the sense of panic, but of deep, tightening tension. Men began to hallucinate sound. They imagined footsteps above the hull. They heard phantom pings in the stillness. The hydrophone operator shook his head, unsure whether the next sound was a ship or a trick of the brain. In the sleeping quarters, sailors clenched their eyes shut, trying not to listen, not to think, not to imagine the explosion that might follow. The quiet-bred superstition. Some believed that thoughts could be heard, that even the memory of laughter might echo too loudly. They kept their minds blank, or tried to. They repeated numbers, songs, prayers, anything to fill the void without sound. The boat itself seemed to understand. It tightened its grip. The temperature rose as systems remained off. Sweat gathered along the men's backs. The air grew stale, oxygen thinning slowly. No one complained. Complaints had volume. When the attack came, it came with fury. A sudden ping, loud and deliberate. A second, closer. Then a series of thuds from above, followed by the unmistakable boom of a depth charge detonating nearby. The hull shook. The lights flickered. Dust rose from the pipes. Men grabbed whatever they could for balance. No screams, no running, just the sharp intake of breath and the grip of white knuckles. Another explosion. Closer. The deck tilted. A bolt snapped near the engine room. Still, the crew held their positions. No one ran. The U-boat dove deeper, the captain giving orders with curt whispers and hand gestures. The silence had been broken, but discipline remained. The third charge exploded farther off. A ripple of hope passed through the control room. Perhaps the enemy had guessed wrong. Perhaps they had drifted. Perhaps the sea, for once, was on their side. Eventually, the noise faded. No more pings. No more charges. The boat continued downward for a time, then leveled off. The silence returned, heavier now, filled with memory. Only after another hour did the captain lift silent running. The fans returned. The lights warmed. The cook began to boil water. In the galley, two men sat quietly, sharing tea without words. One of them had torn his sleeve without noticing. The other handed him a patch and needle. Throughout the boat, life resumed. But it moved slower, more carefully. The silence had left something behind. A presence. A reminder. Silent running was more than a tactic. It was a transformation. The boat became invisible, not by cloak, but by discipline. The crew became shadows, their voices stored for later. And in the stillness of the deep, they waited, patient, listening, unseen. Chapter 9. The Captain's Burden. In the confined world of the U-boat, rank was visible, but rarely spoken. The men knew who they answered to. The orders were followed without question, not because they were barked or forced, but because they came from the one man aboard who had no luxury of doubt. He was the captain, the only figure whose decisions could never waver, whose judgment had to be clear even in the most uncertain hour. Captain Lieutenant Ernst Lehman had been a quiet man long before he was handed the keys to a submarine. His voice did not need volume to command attention. His posture never shifted, whether surrounded by crewmen or standing alone in the conning tower. In his eyes there was the trace of constant calculation, a kind of stillness that came from a mind always measuring, balancing, deciding. To his men, Lehman was a figure both near and distant. They saw him every day, passed him in the corridor, shared his presence in the control room, but he remained apart, as if held behind an invisible wall of responsibility. He did not joke easily. He did not speak idly. Every word was considered. Every gesture meant something. This separation was not created out of pride. It was necessity. Command aboard a submarine was unlike any other form of leadership. There were no open fields, no distant battle lines, no chain of officers spread out across tents or cabins. The captain lived with his men, shoulder to shoulder, day and night, breathing the same air, eating the same bread, hearing the same groans of metal under pressure. But unlike them, he could never afford to falter. His bunk, positioned just behind the control room, was not private in the way one might imagine. It was curtained off, not walled. Inside were a narrow bed, a desk bolted to the floor, a single shelf holding letters from home, and a map rack tucked beside the hatch. It was not comfort, only space to think, to chart, to plan. Sleep was brief. Rest came not with the change of watch, but when time allowed. More often than not, Lehman remained awake long after his officers had retired. He would sit at his desk, oil lamp burning low, studying weather forecasts, enemy convoy routes, depth charts. The war was not won through force alone. It was won by patience, intuition, and knowing when to disappear. He bore the burden of silence. The crew was not told everything. They couldn't be. There were times when Lehman was forced to make decisions that ran counter to what instinct might demand. When to dive, when to stay surfaced, when to fire, when to wait. He alone knew the full picture. He read the intelligence briefs. He interpreted the changing tone of the sonar. He carried the knowledge of past patrols, both successes and losses. And when things went wrong, it was his weight to carry. There were moments when the air shifted, when a mistake almost occurred, when a near collision with a convoy escort forced a hasty dive, when an engine faltered just as they entered a silent run. In those moments, the crew looked to him, not for comfort, but for certainty. He gave it without blinking. Even when his heart pounded, even when the hair at the back of his neck rose, he remained still. A nod, a short command, a glance to the first officer. These were his tools. He knew that panic could ripple outward like oil on water, and so he allowed none to begin. It was not bravado. It was resolve. He knew every man aboard by name, though he rarely used them. He remembered birthdays. He noticed when someone grew quieter. He watched for the signs of strain, not because he had time, but because he could not afford not to. Leadership on a U-boat was not a matter of charm or speeches. It was attentiveness, restraint, and the ability to act alone when no one else could. He was not feared. He was respected. And respect was a more useful currency. There were moments when he stood alone in the conning tower, looking through the periscope. During surface runs, especially at night, he would take the watch himself for an hour or two, not to rest his crew, but to remind himself of the vastness above. Stars overhead, black sea below. The U-boat invisible in both directions. It was in those moments that the weight pressed hardest. He thought of the decisions not yet made, of the lives he might lose if he hesitated, of the families who waited at docks with no letters received. of the men who would follow his orders, even if they led into fire. He did not speak of these thoughts. There was no one to hear them. That, too, was part of the burden. The greatest strain was choice. Every day brought decisions with no perfect answer. Should they chase the convoy spotted at a distance, risking detection for a chance at success? Should they dive early and lose hours to silent drift, or stay surfaced and gamble with enemy patrols? Should they fire a torpedo and reveal their position, or let the opportunity pass to preserve stealth? Each option was a weight in his hands, and there was no time for hesitation. Some captains made their names through boldness, some through caution. Layman believed in balance. He trusted instinct, but only after information. He questioned his own assumptions constantly, not out of insecurity, but out of obligation. He confided in his logbook. There, in short, precise handwriting, he recorded the facts of each day: the position, the weather, the status of the crew, minor events, mechanical issues, and beneath it all, notes to himself, observations, doubts, reminders. It was not a diary. It was a ledger of command. He never wrote about fear, not because he didn't feel it, but because it didn't belong on the page. The officers under him, the navigator, the first watch officer, the engineer, all trusted him implicitly. They knew he would not waste their lives. They also knew he would not hesitate to give the hardest order if it meant the mission's success. That balance earned him loyalty without ever asking for it. He rarely raised his voice. When he did, it was not in anger, but urgency. His tone shifted. His words grew sharper. The crew responded instantly. There was no question, no delay. And once the moment passed, he returned to calm. The storm existed only when needed. His hardest moments came not during combat, but in quiet decisions. Turning away from a convoy to preserve fuel. Abandoning a damaged merchant ship to avoid retaliation. Skipping a planned resupply rendezvous due to intercepted transmissions. Each of these decisions left a mark, not on the crew, who often didn't know the details, but on him. The burden of command was not just in what he chose to do. It was in what he chose to carry alone. He kept a photograph in his shelf, a small, black and white image of a woman and child smiling in a summer garden. He looked at it sometimes, late at night, when the boat drifted quietly beneath the surface and the rest of the crew slept. He never mentioned them, but they were there, always just behind his thoughts. In the event of failure, he had standing orders. The logbook would be destroyed, the codes burned. If the hull was breached beyond repair and surfacing was not an option, he would be the last to leave the control room, or not leave at all. This, too, was part of the oath. He never asked his crew for loyalty. He earned it by carrying what they could not. He allowed them to laugh when he would not. He gave them the illusion of stability when he carried the storm beneath his coat. He listened to the sea with one ear, and to the breathing of 50 men with the other. When they returned to port, if they returned, he stood last on the ladder as the hatch opened. He watched the men climb into daylight, blinking, grinning, alive. He waited until they had stepped off the boat. Then, and only then, did he follow. And no one saw the relief on his face. Chapter 10: Men Without Sky. The last glimpse of the sky had been pale and quiet. Early morning mist curling over the harbor, a haze where the sun should have been, the faint outline of gulls vanishing into cloud. Then the hatch closed, and from that moment on, the sky became memory. The men of the U-boat did not speak often of the sun. It would have seemed foolish, even fragile, to admit missing something so basic. But the absence was deeply felt. It was not the heat or the color they longed for. It was the reference point. Without the sky, time had no anchor. Without sunlight or moonlight, the days became a long and unbroken stretch of artificial light and recycled breath. Inside the submarine, every bulb was a stand-in for the real world. At first, the red lighting was meant to protect night vision, to ease the shift between above and below. But over time, it became the only lighting, not just functional, but permanent. The red glow softened edges, flattened faces, and blurred distinctions between waking and dreaming. It turned the corridors into half-lit caves, the bunks into cocoons. There were no windows, no portholes, no way to mark morning, afternoon, or dusk. The passing of time became a mechanical rhythm, a bell signaling the start of a shift, a spoon against a mug marking the next meal. Without sunlight, the body forgot how to feel time. Circadian rhythms faded. Men grew tired at odd hours, wide awake when they should have slept. The watches rotated, but the body resisted. And soon, even resistance faded. In the early days of patrol, some crew members tried to keep time with wristwatches. A few marked calendars on the wall near their bunks. Others made notes in their journals. These were small private battles against the growing blur of hours. But after the first week, most gave up. The submarine didn't care what day it was, and eventually, neither did its crew. Dreams changed. Men reported stranger visions, drifting memories that melted into each other. The border between conscious thought and sleeping hallucination thinned. One sailor confessed to dreaming in red, as if the very lighting of the boat had soaked into his imagination. Another dreamt repeatedly of climbing toward a sky he could not reach, waking each time just before he broke through the surface. Fatigue deepened this confusion. With only 4 hours between watches, true rest was rare. The bunks remained warm from the last occupant, damp with breath and condensation. There was no sunrise to signal that sleep was over, only a gentle tap on the shoulder and a quiet word, "Your turn." The cook tried to create rhythm with meals, serving hot food during what would have been day, dry rations in the hours that resembled night. But even that broke down over time. Hunger came randomly. Some men skipped meals out of weariness. Others hoarded small snacks in their lockers, nibbling in silence when their bodies demanded fuel. The loss of weather was another kind of disconnection. There was no wind in the submarine, no rain, no scent of snow or salt spray. Even when the boat surfaced, the conning tower remained sealed unless the conditions were clear, and even then, only a few men were allowed on deck at a time. Most stayed below, waiting, hoping that someone might return with news of stars. It was said that during long patrols, sailors forgot the color blue, that their dreams became dark, that the word sky felt fictional, a concept more than a memory. One man scratched an outline of a sun onto the wall near his bunk. Not detailed, just a circle with lines. He touched it before sleep, not for luck, but to remind himself that it still existed. The officers noticed the shift. Tension rose slowly, not in bursts, but in withdrawals. Men became less talkative. Jokes faded. Laughter grew quieter. Eye contact shortened. Even the routine conversations, the small talk of food and family, began to taper. The men weren't angry. They were untethered. Without the sky, the world lost contrast. Everything felt inward. The body pressed against the metal. The mind curled inward, searching for light in memories instead of the horizon. The doctor, such as he was, had little to offer. He had bandages, aspirin, iodine. Nothing for the soul. When asked about the fatigue, the mood, the dreams, he said what he could: rest more, write letters, drink water. But he knew as well as anyone that the cure was above them, far beyond reach. Some men found small comforts. A sailor who kept a travel book in his locker, photos of mountains, lakes, cities. He opened it each day, flipping slowly through pages without words. Another hummed the same tune before each shift, something his mother sang when he was a boy. A few clung to their letters, rereading them by the soft red light until they could recite every line from memory. The captain encouraged discipline, not denial. He allowed no schedule changes, no lapses in drills. The routine was a tether. He understood that flexibility, though kind, would only unmoor them further. In the absence of sun, the clock was law. Still, there were moments when he too sought space. He would sometimes climb into the conning tower alone, just beneath the hatch. He'd close his eyes, rest a hand on the cold ladder, and breathe deeply. He never opened the hatch, but standing there, one step below the sky, was enough. In the quiet hours during silent running or long stretches between tasks, the submarine became dreamlike. The crew moved slowly. The boat drifted soundlessly. And all around them, water. No light, no sky, just depth. This condition had a name among sailors: depth fatigue. Not physical exhaustion, but existential. A sense of being too far from the surface for too long. It was not panic. It was something softer, but more persistent. A slow erosion of self. On land, people measure time by sunrises and sunsets. They measure change by seasons, by weather, by the color of leaves. In the U-boat, change was measured in engine noise, battery levels, and the growing odor of bodies packed into steel. It was not enough. When they finally surfaced, sometimes after days or weeks submerged, the hatch opened like the lid of a tomb. Men climbed the ladder slowly, blinking into the gray light. Even when the sky was overcast, they stared upward, eyes wide, jaws slack. Some smiled. Others said nothing. They just breathed. The wind touched their faces. The salt returned to their tongues. And for a few precious minutes, they stood beneath the open sky, men made small again by the vastness above them. Then the order came. The hatch closed. The ladder creaked, and the submarine slipped below the waves once more. Chapter 11, Tales in the Dark. Long before war, long before engines and steel hulls, men turned to stories in the dark. Around campfires, beneath tents, inside taverns and cabins, stories softened fear, passed the hours, filled silence with something warmer than breath. Inside the U-boat, where time stretched and fear sharpened in silence, storytelling became more than tradition. It became necessity. There were no roaring tales told over laughter and mugs of beer. These stories were not shouted across tables or spun dramatically with sweeping arms. The space would not allow for that. Inside the submarine, everything was whispered, and so the stories came quietly, passed between bunks during long off watches, exchanged in low voices beside torpedoes, shared between bites of stale bread in the galley. Some were true. Others had once been true, then changed slightly in retelling. A few were invented entirely, not to deceive, but to entertain. Truth mattered less than tone. In the dim red light, facts softened. Imagination filled the gaps. The youngest sailors listened most. They had not yet heard all the versions. Their eyes were wider, their laughter less restrained. The older men, though they might roll their eyes at the start of a familiar tale, often smiled halfway through. They knew how it ended, and still, they waited to hear it told again. The submarine itself became a setting. Some of the stories were about past patrols, ships narrowly escaped, convoys destroyed in daring attacks, mechanical failures that ended with clever fixes and sudden luck. Names of lost boats were spoken quietly, with respect. Boats that dove and did not return. Crews that vanished in the deep without a signal. These were not ghost stories. They were eulogies, but there were lighter tales too. One sailor insisted that on his first patrol, their cook had accidentally fed them horse meat for 3 weeks straight, Another swore that a crewman had once smuggled a live chicken aboard for luck, and that it had laid eggs until the 10th day, when it died of fear during a depth charge attack. There were jokes passed down from boat to boat. Not particularly clever, but well-worn, familiar. About engineers marrying their wrenches. About sonar operators who heard their own heartbeat and thought it was an enemy submarine. About the stench in the crew quarters being classified as a chemical weapon. These jokes were not meant to earn roars of laughter. They were bridges, links between men who shared the same burden. The best storyteller was Oberbootsman Kraus, a short, wiry man with thinning hair and an easy voice. He spoke without raising it, always calm, like a father reading by candlelight. He didn't force stories. He waited until someone asked. Often, it began with a glance, a subtle look across the galley table during a particularly quiet watch. Kraus would nod, finish chewing, then begin without preface. He told stories about his childhood in a village near the Baltic coast. About the first time he saw a ship, a fishing vessel, painted white, with sails that snapped in the wind like flags. He spoke of sneaking out at night with his brother to catch frogs in a lantern jar, of watching storms roll in over flat farmland, of stealing a kiss from a baker's daughter in the shadow of a flour mill. But his stories didn't stay on land. He spoke of his first days at sea, the captain who taught him how to read charts, the time he got lost in the engine room and fell asleep behind a tank, waking up 3 hours later, convinced they had left without him. The patrol, where their periscope fogged up and they tracked a shadow for hours, thinking it was a destroyer, only to realize it was a floating log. His stories had pauses in all the right places. He never rushed, never embellished needlessly. When he finished, he didn't wait for applause. He simply smiled, leaned back, and let silence return. Other men took their turn, though none with Kraus's ease. The mechanic shared a tale of fixing a ruptured steam valve while the boat tilted at a 20-degree angle, water leaking into the stern, tools slipping underfoot, the chief shouting over the noise. He mimicked the chief's voice, deep, gravelly, constantly annoyed. Everyone recognized it. The imitation was perfect. Even the chief himself, half asleep in the corner, cracked a smile. The youngest sailor, barely 20, told a story about his grandfather's farm. Nothing dramatic, just a description of the fields, the smell of apples in the fall, the way the sun came through the barn roof in the mornings. He spoke slowly, searching for words, clearly unused to an audience. But no one interrupted. The stillness held, and when he finished, the quiet that followed was not awkward. It was full. Sometimes the stories took stranger turns. One man described a dream he'd had the night before. He was walking through the submarine, but everything was wrong. The walls were made of wood. The engines ran on coal. There was a garden growing in the torpedo room, with vines wrapping around the steel and tomatoes hanging above the bunks. No one questioned the dream. In the submarine, dreams often felt real. There were stories told in pieces. Begun one night, continued the next. Tales that spanned watches, interrupted by alarms or meals or the need to dive. The teller would resume where he left off, as if no time had passed. These stories became shared property, the listeners helping fill in details, correcting each other gently, laughing at remembered moments. In these exchanges, rank dissolved. Officers and enlisted men sat side by side, knees nearly touching in the narrow space, heads leaning toward the same voice. For those few minutes, there were no orders, no tension, only the sound of words wrapping around tired ears. There were also stories never told aloud, memories kept close, revisited silently during the darkest hours. A wedding day, a sister's laugh, the smell of bread in winter. These private stories surfaced unbidden, carried by fatigue or hunger or longing. They were not shared, but they filled the boat all the same. Music had its place, too. A few men hummed old folk tunes during routine maintenance, barely audible over the sound of turning valves or coiling cables. Someone had a harmonica, though it was rarely used, not because it wasn't allowed, but because the weight of silence often felt too heavy to break. One night, during a rare surface interval, a crewman stood on deck and sang just one verse into the wind, a song from his childhood. Others listened from below. No one applauded, but no one forgot. As the patrol wore on, the stories changed. They grew softer, slower. Less about the war, more about life before it. Less about danger, more about family. A man recited a letter from his wife, reading it aloud in the galley. Her words, simple and plain, landed with surprising force. A new coat bought for the winter, a neighbor's wedding, the cat chasing snowflakes. For a moment, the submarine seemed far away from the sea. Storytelling became a form of resistance, against fear, against time, against the slow erosion of self beneath the surface. It reminded the crew that they had lives beyond the steel, that they were not just sailors or uniforms or numbers on a roster. They were sons, brothers, husbands, lovers. They were people who had lived outside of pressure gauges and sonar pings. And in telling, they remembered. Even the captain, though rarely a participant, listened. From the shadows, he watched the faces of his men, how they leaned forward, how they smiled, how the sharp lines of exhaustion softened in the presence of a voice weaving memory into words. He knew better than anyone what silence could do, and so he never stopped the stories. In the deepest dark, when the engines were off and the sea pressed close, a whispered tale could feel like light. Chapter 12, Flood Alarm. It began with a sound, not a loud crash or a scream, not the boom of a depth charge or the sharp ping of sonar. No, it was quieter than that. A trickle, the soft hiss of something not quite right, the sound of water moving where it shouldn't. At first, it was dismissed. The submarine always made sounds. Pipes groaned, bulkheads flexed, condensation dripped steadily from above. But this sound was different, faster, more purposeful, a sound that didn't belong to the rhythm of a boat in order. The first to notice was a machinist working near the forward battery compartment. He paused, straightened up, and tilted his head. He didn't speak. He didn't call out. Instead, he moved closer to the sound, his boots silent on the damp metal floor. And then he saw it, a fine stream of water arcing from a valve seam, spraying against the far wall. It glistened in the red light like a vein opened beneath the skin of the hull. Thin at first, constant, cold. He reached for the valve instinctively, but he didn't touch it. Instead, he turned and walked, not fast, but firmly, toward the control room. There was no need to run. Running made noise, and the emergency needed more than panic. It needed attention. Within seconds, the control room was alive with motion, precise, practiced, silent. The words water intrusion were spoken once, then no more. Officers didn't need explanation. The drill began before it was ordered. Men moved quickly through the corridor, tools in hand, checking the pressure dials along the bulkhead, listening closely at the seams of the hull. The submarine was still submerged, deep enough that no sound from within could risk rising to the surface. Silent running was in effect, but that didn't matter now. Not entirely. The leak hadn't stopped. If anything, the stream was growing. The chief engineer stepped into the compartment with two men trailing behind him. He knelt beside the valve, fingers brushing along the metal casing, feeling the spray without flinching. He didn't speak. He only tapped the pipe with his wrench, once, twice, then nodded. A hairline fracture, likely from pressure fatigue. A minor failure, for now. But in a submarine, nothing is minor. The danger wasn't just the leak itself. It was what it could become. A crack could widen. A joint could give. A burst pipe could drown the compartment in minutes. Worse, the water could find its way to the batteries, and if seawater mixed with them, it would produce chlorine gas. Poisonous. Fast. Unforgiving. The captain arrived without sound. He stood at the threshold of the compartment and watched. His arms remained at his sides. His eyes scanned the floor, the pipe, the faces of the men working. "Seal it," he said quietly. And they did. Rags were packed around the seam. A clamp was tightened. A pressure release valve was adjusted to reduce strain. The flow slowed, then stopped. But water remained on the floor, slick, shallow, cold as bone. The next step was inspection. All nearby compartments were checked. Boots moved through the submarine with a new caution. Hands touched every panel. Ears pressed to walls. The air was still, but no longer calm. It was alert. The danger wasn't over. 10 minutes later, in the stern, a second leak was found, smaller, near an access hatch rarely used. This one was easier. A bolt tightened, a seal reinforced. But it confirmed what no one wanted to admit. The hull was beginning to feel the pressure. They had been submerged for too long, diving deep, repeatedly, evading threats. The steel, strong as it was, had limits. The captain gathered his officers and spoke in low tones. The decision was made. They would rise, slowly, carefully, to a shallower depth. Not to surface, not yet, but to reduce the strain. To give the boat a breath of its own. In the forward compartment, the floor was mopped dry. The machinist remained nearby, watching the patched valve like a sentry guarding a wound. He didn't blink much. He didn't move far. Someone handed him a cup of tea. He set it down without drinking. The silence returned, but it had changed. It was no longer protective. It was listening. Everyone aboard had heard it now, the sound of water. It was soft, unassuming, but it stayed in the ears long after it was gone. Men lay in their bunks that night and heard phantom drips. They imagined streams winding through seams, puddles forming beneath their feet. Dreams turned to pressure gauges and flooded stairwells. Still, the boat held. The repairs were checked again. The crew returned to rotation. The leak, though real, had not spread. The battery compartment was dry. The air remained clear. The submarine continued forward, but something had shifted. In the galley, conversation slowed. In the sleeping quarters, men rolled over more often, adjusting their positions to listen. Some pressed their hands to the walls before bed, feeling for vibration. It wasn't fear exactly, more like awareness. A heightened sense that they lived inside something fragile. The captain made no speech. He never did. He trusted the silence to deliver what words could not. During the next watch, the engineer replaced a length of pipe entirely, not because it had failed, but because it might. Preventative maintenance became obsessive. Wrenches turned more often. Valves were rechecked every hour. Men asked more questions about the air pressure, the temperature, the depth. The machinist who had first heard the leaks said little afterward, but others looked at him differently, with a quiet kind of respect. He had listened closely enough to hear the sea creeping in. And in a place like this, that mattered more than anything. Later that week, the leak was nearly forgotten. The patch held. The replacement parts were secure. But the memory of the sound, that first spray, like a breath drawn in the dark, remained. It was a reminder that the boat was not invincible. That steel bent. That pressure found weakness. and that sometimes the only warning a crew received was a trickle where none should be. And so they listened more closely, not just to the sea, but to the metal, to each other, and to the sound of water wading in the deep. Chapter 13. Enemy Above. The first sign was a change in the water's voice. It came through the hydrophone, a subtle shift in background sound that only trained ears would notice. At first, it was just a different kind of hum. Then came the rhythm, fast, sharp, mechanical. Propellers, more than one. The pattern didn't match cargo ships. This was faster, tighter, military. The operator adjusted the dial slowly, breathing shallowly as he tried to focus. He didn't lift his head, just raised a hand flat and still until the officer beside him leaned in. 2 screws, fast, intermittent pinging, likely destroyers. Those words passed through the control room like a current. No alarm sounded. Not yet. But everyone felt it, that subtle coil of energy that snapped into place when danger confirmed its arrival. Conversation ceased. Footsteps softened. Hands moved toward gauges and levers as naturally as breath. Above them, the surface world remained invisible. But the soundscape told its own story. 2, possibly 3 destroyers, sweeping slowly across the area with deliberate intent. The pings began soon after, sonar pulses cast down into the sea like invisible spears, searching for something hidden. The captain listened without speaking. His hand rested on the edge of the plotting table. Pencil tapped once, then stilled. Every movement now would matter. Every vibration. Every pulse of electricity through the hull. He gave the order in a voice no louder than the others. Silent running. Once more, the submarine became a shadow. Engines fell to their quietest hum. Pumps reduced to a bare whisper. Non-essential systems were cut. Even breathing felt louder in that moment. The hull took on a new tension, not from strain, but from stillness. A steel animal playing dead in the deep. Above, the destroyers swept back and forth. The hydrophone operator listened with increasing precision. He could track their movement, the change in pitch, the angle of approach. They were using active sonar now, not just listening, but hunting, their pings echoing downward in rhythmic waves. Each time the sound touched the hull, it reverberated faintly through the metal. The boat shuddered inside itself. Not from impact, but from exposure. The feeling was not unlike being touched by a searchlight in a dark field, invisible to the eye, but unmistakably lit. No one moved unless they had to. The control room was full, but silent. Faces stayed turned toward instruments, eyes narrowed. Sweat formed along necks and temples, not from heat, but from the weight of waiting. Then came the first depth charge. It exploded above and behind them, far enough not to cause damage, but close enough to shake the walls. A deep thump, followed by a wave of pressure that pressed against the ribs and left the ears ringing. Another followed, closer. The boat jolted. A light flickered. One of the younger sailors reached instinctively for the edge of the table, his knuckles white. No one spoke. No one needed to. The charges came in patterns. Spaced. Strategic. Designed to trap, not just destroy. The destroyers moved like wolves above a den, circling. They weren't sure the submarine was there. Not yet, but they suspected. And they had time. The captain adjusted the depth by 2 meters. A gentle descent. He said nothing to explain. Everyone understood. A shift, just enough to confuse targeting. The boat creaked softly in response. Pipes groaned as pressure changed. Another detonation. This one above and ahead. Closer. Something fell from a shelf in the galley. The sound rang too loudly. The cook cursed under his breath and pressed the pot flat against the floor with one hand. In the forward compartment, a wrench had rolled under a cot. The machinist retrieved it and held it to his chest, breathing through his nose, eyes closed. The depth charges continued for nearly an hour. The pattern shifted slightly. 2 destroyers passed close overhead, then circled again. At one point, the sonar pings became faster, more urgent. The crew held their breath as one. But then, distance returned. The pings faded. The propellers slowed. Perhaps they had lost them. The hydrophone operator shook his head, signaling, still listening. Still too close. Inside the hull, the pressure had changed again. Not physically, but emotionally. The fear had passed its peak. Now came the exhaustion. That draining, electric fatigue that follows when the body realizes it might survive. The captain remained still. His posture didn't change. Only his eyes shifted, watching the sonar, then the faces of his men. Slowly, he raised a hand. The order was simple. Hold. For another hour, the submarine barely moved. Some crewmen closed their eyes and dozed, despite the risk. Others stared blankly at bolts and rivets. The hydrophone operator leaned forward, brow furrowed, chasing every ripple in the sea's dark voice. Eventually, the ocean grew quiet. The destroyers, unable to confirm contact, moved on. Their engines faded into the background hum of a restless sea. No more pings, no more charges. Just the slow, distant churn of warships heading west. But the submarine did not rise. Not yet. Even after the hunters were gone, the hunted had to wait. Protocol demanded patience. The sea could deceive. And if another vessel was still nearby, it would be listening for the mistake. The hum of machinery returning too early. The sound of relief. Only after nightfall did the captain allow the motors to increase. The boat ascended, slowly, cautiously, like an animal wounded but not broken. As it reached periscope depth, the conning tower filled with quiet tension. No ships, no lights, only black water under a moonless sky. The captain stood at the scope and scanned slowly. He lingered at each angle, taking in nothing, confirming it was really nothing. Then he turned to the first officer and gave the signal to surface. The hatch opened to a cold wind. The sea air rushed in, stinging eyes and cooling skin. Crewmen climbed up in pairs, scanning the horizon. They checked for aircraft, searchlights, silhouettes. There was nothing but darkness and waves. The hunt was over. For now. Back below, the mood shifted. The galley stirred again. Tea was brewed. Bread passed around. The quiet resumed, but it felt different. Not fear now, just fatigue. Survival left a mark. Not a scar, exactly, but a deep breath drawn slower than before. In the crew quarters, no one spoke of the charges. No one replayed the moments. They had heard enough sound for one day. Instead, they drifted into sleep, some immediately, others not until long after the lights dimmed. Above them, the sky stretched wide and silent. But deep down, the steel hull remembered. So did the men. Chapter 14. Surface and Risk. The order to surface was never given lightly. It didn't arrive with excitement or even hope. It was a calculation, deliberate, weighted, and quiet. A response not to comfort, but to need. Every submerged patrol had its limit. Even the best U-boat, with its refined battery cells and carefully measured air scrubbers, could only remain beneath the waves for so long. The engines required air. The crew needed oxygen. And if the batteries were not recharged in time, the boat would drift powerless in the deep, a silent husk of steel at the mercy of currents and fate. And so, when the levels dropped too far, when the internal atmosphere thickened and the breath of 50 men began to stagnate, the captain gave the nod. Subtle. Final. It was time to rise. The preparations began immediately, and always without ceremony. This was not celebration. It was exposure. The engines were adjusted. Ballast shifted. Depth planes were re-angled. Slowly, carefully, the U-boat began to climb, not like a swimmer, but like a creature testing the water above with cautious motion. The hull creaked softly as pressure decreased. Gauges flickered upward, and then, with a gentle rise, the boat broke through the surface. There was no applause, no cheer, only the hiss of the ballast vents and the quiet metallic clank of the outer hatch unlocking. The first moments were always tense. Even before the hatch fully opened, officers scanned the horizon with periscopes and radios. One man climbed into the conning tower, his head just above the rim, binoculars raised. He swept the sea in every direction, not for ships, but for aircraft. The real threat came from the sky. The North Atlantic was never still. Wind blew sharp across the surface, and waves slapped hard against the hull. But it wasn't nature the crew feared. It was the sudden roar of engines overhead, the slicing shadow of a patrol plane, the flash of sunlight on wings before the sound of gunfire. Above water, the U-boat was fast, but not fast enough, and it was fragile. Aircraft could see for miles. They could strike quickly without warning. The seconds between detection and attack were few, often too few to dive in time. If the submarine was caught exposed, it might never get below again. And yet, they had to surface. Diesel engines only worked in open air. They drew in the oxygen that the electric motors could not. While surfaced, the batteries below could be recharged, restoring the life force of the vessel. It took hours during which the boat was vulnerable, clearly outlined against the sea. The crew worked knowing this. Every second on the surface came with a cost. The deck filled with quiet motion. Men emerged in pairs, moving with discipline, boots thudding softly on wet steel. One stood watch, scanning the sky with binoculars. Another monitored the radio aerial. A few stepped to the edge of the tower, peering into the endless blue, their shoulders hunched against the wind. The engine noise changed, louder now, freer. The diesel motors roared to life, sending vibrations through the hull that felt different from the low hum of the submerged drive. The submarine vibrated like a living thing again. And with it came the air. Fresh, wild, cold. It cut through the recycled breath of the deep. It stirred clothes, cooled sweat, and cleared the lungs. Even after weeks submerged, no one commented on it. No one dared to speak of how much they needed it. But every man breathed deeper. Below deck, the stale atmosphere began to shift. The scrubbers caught their breath. The smell of fuel returned, but it came with the oxygen that carried it. Crew members moved more quickly now, their bodies reawakening in the fresher air. Faces looked less gray. Eyes cleared. In the galley, kettles were heated. Bread was warmed. Meals took on new shape, not just sustenance, but something closer to comfort. Music, rarely heard, crackled softly through the radio. Not from the surface ships, not from the Navy. A distant broadcast from somewhere in France or Norway. A woman's voice reading headlines. A violin playing a waltz. For a few moments, the war felt farther away, but only for moments. The threat of aircraft never left their minds. Lookouts rotated every few minutes. their shoulders tense, binoculars steady. The sky, open and blue above, was both gift and menace. A silent patch of color that might, at any instant, turn deadly. One sailor described it later as standing in a clearing in the woods, knowing hunters were nearby. You breathe more freely, yes, but you didn't move your feet. Sometimes the submarine would surface during night hours, late evening, early morning, when darkness gave some protection. The stars would stretch above in sharp points of silver, and the sea would glow faintly with plankton in their wake. These were the rare times the men could step onto the deck and look up without fear. They didn't speak. They just looked. Some held their arms across their chests. Others leaned on the rail. The youngest often tilted their heads back fully, trying to take it all in, as if their skulls could stretch enough to hold the sky. The air on those nights was cold enough to bite, but no one returned below early. They stayed as long as orders allowed. For many, it was the only reminder they had that the world still existed beyond the steel. But even these quiet nights came with risk. The Allies had radar. Even under cover of darkness, aircraft could find them. If the signal was strong enough, if the frequency caught the shape of the tower, the enemy would come. There were times when it happened without warning. A shout from the tower. A sudden command. Dive, dive. The crew scrambled into motion, leaving equipment mid-repair, meals uneaten, hatches swinging shut behind them. The submarine dropped beneath the surface in under a minute, engines gasping as they pulled in one last breath before vanishing. Once submerged again, silence returned. But the adrenaline remained. The surfacing had ended. The moment was gone. And with it, the breath of the sky. Even when no aircraft appeared, the captain never surfaced longer than necessary. The risks were too great. Once the batteries were charged, once the tanks refilled, once the radio messages had been received and logged, he gave the word to dive. The hatch was sealed again. The red lights returned. The boat shifted downward, and the men once more became shadows. Yet each surfacing, no matter how brief, left a mark, a flicker of the horizon in memory, a lungful of wind that could not be replicated. A silence above that sounded different than the one below. These moments stayed with them, not as stories, but as breath. Chapter 15. The Return, if they're lucky. The final days of patrol always carried a strange stillness. It wasn't peace. Not really. The sea was never quiet, and the war had no interest in granting calm. But as the U-boat made its long journey back toward its hidden port, a kind of hush settled over the crew, a heaviness that drifted through the compartments like fog. There was less talk now. Less banter in the galley, fewer murmured jokes. The weariness ran too deep for small distractions. Muscles ached from tension. Eyes stung from weeks without sunlight. Every step echoed a little louder than it had before, as if the boat itself knew the end was near and had grown cautious, reluctant to make promises. Rations were nearly gone. What little remained came from tins, mostly starch and fat, dense crackers, gray meat, bitter coffee. The fresh food had vanished weeks earlier, and with it, the last comfort of flavor. Meals were chewed in silence, more fuel than nourishment. Some men developed stomach cramps from the sameness. Others forced bites down only to ward off the weakness they couldn't afford. The cook, once the warm heart of the boat, had grown quieter too. He still tried, adding salt, warming water, keeping the galley clean, but even his efforts felt thin, worn out by repetition. The air inside the submarine had changed again. It had grown stale, not just from carbon dioxide, but from familiarity. The scent of diesel and steel, of sweat and machinery no longer registered. The men barely noticed it. They were part of it now. Even their skin held the smell of the boat, a kind of permanent imprint, like soot soaked into cloth. Conversations drifted toward home. Carefully. Not loudly, not in great detail. But here and there, between tasks, a sailor might mention a street name, a bakery, a smell he missed. Another would answer with a nod, not a word. They understood. The idea of home was like a star glimpsed on the surface, distant, quiet, and necessary. No one spoke of the boats that hadn't returned, but everyone knew. By that point in the war, the odds were brutal. More than half of the submarines sent out never came back. Some were lost to enemy fire. Others simply vanished. No call, no signal, no wreckage. Just a name removed from the roster and silence in its place. The men aboard this boat knew the statistics, knew the faces of other crews that had once stood on the same dock, knew that luck played as much a role as training, that even the best commander couldn't outpace a well-placed charge from above. So when they reached the final stretch, when the charts marked them less than a day from port, the silence deepened even further. The sea, in those hours, became an enemy of its own. Any sound could betray them. Any ripple of periscope or engine churn might carry to an unseen patrol. The final miles were always traveled submerged, slowly, with sonar sweeping and every man braced for the worst. No one slept deeply. Some didn't sleep at all. They lay on their bunks with their hands folded, eyes open, counting not hours but pulses, waiting for a signal, waiting for home to confirm it still existed. Then, a sound on the hydrophone, not enemy this time, a friend, a coded message, coordinates for surfacing, a phrase known only to those permitted to return. The captain repeated it once, quietly, then gave the order. The ballast tanks released. The boat rose. Faster this time. Hope did that. When they broke the surface, it was near dusk. The sky overhead was soft with clouds. The wind carried the scent of pine and salt. And in the distance, almost too far to trust, came a flicker of light on a tower. A lighthouse, perhaps, or a signal from shore. Some men wept. They didn't cry loudly. No sobs, no gasps, just the quiet kind, tears that rolled over cheeks without effort, that dropped from chins and dried in the sea air. The captain didn't speak. He stood on the conning tower and watched the land appear in patches, first as shadow, then as shape. Trees, then buildings. A dock. A figure waving. The return to port was not swift. The harbor remained a target. The crew kept low. The boat moved at minimal speed, but no one cared. They were home, or close enough to believe it. As the U-boat approached the hidden bay, other figures appeared. Ground crew, medical staff, officers. They stood waiting in heavy coats, clipboards in hand, eyes already scanning for damage, for stories, for loss. When the boat finally moored, no music played. There was no parade. Just ropes thrown, ladders lowered, boots stepping back onto land that felt slightly unreal. Some men stumbled, knees uncertain. Others looked around as if the world had changed in their absence. It had, of course. But so had they. A doctor checked pulses. A nurse handed out canteens. Questions were asked. Few were answered. Gear was unloaded. Reports prepared. Orders delivered. Another patrol was already planned for the coming month. A new crew would board. This one would be debriefed, then dismissed to quarters. Temporary rest. In the barracks, showers hissed. Steam rose. skin scrubbed raw in an attempt to feel human again. For many, the scent of soap was more overwhelming than the diesel they had lived with. It stung their eyes. It smelled unfamiliar. Clean clothes were issued, letters handed out. For some, photographs were waiting. For others, only silence. The lucky ones had family nearby. The rest walked the streets slowly, unsure what to do with the noise, the space, the color of the world again. At night, many couldn't sleep. Beds felt too soft. The room too still. Some missed the hum of the engines. Others craved the tightness of the hull. Land had space, and space made room for thoughts, things they had kept buried while beneath the sea. And always there were the missing. They weren't spoken of directly, but their absence was felt like a shadow behind the eyes. A man might pass a familiar cot and remember who used to sleep there, or see an old boot mark on the deck and pause, just for a second, before walking on. Eventually, leave would end. The submarine would be cleaned, rearmed, repaired. Another mission charted, another crew summoned. Some of the same men would go again. Others would be reassigned. A few would vanish into paperwork, never returning to sea. But most would return, not because they wanted to, but because that was what the war demanded. And the boat, the steel Coffin, would dive once more. But for now, they had survived. They had returned. And in a war that swallowed whole crews without warning, that was a kind of miracle.